And over time, I found sort of so many advantages of this way of working, being able to explain the why, the value of trainees seeing me struggle, put a certain idea into words.
Hey, you're back at the Faculty Factory podcast, and I'm Kim Skrupski here at Hopkins. I can't wait for you to learn about some cool stuff from my friend that brand new to the podcast, Dr. Richard Edden. Hi, Richard.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Richard's like, I don't know. I've never done a podcast. I hate listening to my voice, but trust me, this guy is great. Let me tell you how I know Richard. So Richard's here at Hopkins in neuroradiology. He's a professor. He's going to introduce himself formally with all his titles in a moment. But I know Richard because I think about I've been at Hopkins almost 9 years. And I brought this workshop here when I came from Rush in Chicago called Get That Paper Out the Door, Pearls and Pitfalls of Publishing. And my buddy, Dave Usum, who's a frequent flyer on the Faculty Factory podcast, and we would give this like hour and a half long workshop. And we would split it into the 3 very common writing barriers. I have trouble getting started, I don't have any time, and I have trouble finishing. And those 3 elements are also they feature heavily in the concept of WAGs that I came up with back when, writing accountability groups, WAGs. And so Dave said, in his great mentoring style and being a great sponsor and coach that he is, he said, hey, Richard Edden is great at writing. We ought to, share this with him. So Richard always gets the great part of like how to get started. I do the section on there's no time and I don't have any time. And Dave always does the stuff on I have trouble finishing. So that's how I know Richard. I promise you, he has some very cool and interesting takes on how to write. So Richard, I promise I'm going to zip my lip here. You please tell everybody who you are here at Hopkins, and then let's get into it.
Thank you. So as Kim said, I'm professor of radiology at Hopkins, relatively junior professor, and I came through in neuroradiology under the mentorship of Dave Usum, and he was able to help me learn how to develop myself and also gave me opportunities to contribute to some of the faculty development programs. And that really started me thinking about writing and thinking about aspects of writing that I was good at, things that I was less good at, and really sort of analyze the process, which I've found to be really interesting and really helpful. At the moment, I also have a position in our department as Director of Post-Doctoral Fellows. And so I'm thinking a lot about how Post-Doctoral Fellows develop themselves, progressing towards potentially faculty appointments, and what kind of training and thinking people have to do to get to that stage. And I think that one of the huge things you need to be able to do, really at any level of science, but you really need to focus on developing as a postdoctoral fellow and junior faculty member is that writing piece. So I'm excited to talk about that today.
Yes. Now, maybe a little bit of a kind of ground this conversation in some kind of context, because we have a lot of faculty around the world who listen to this podcast. And I want to make sure they understand that I think some people think, well, it must be easy for you, Dr. Edden. I'm sure you have, 100, 200 papers, probably because it comes naturally to you. You were born writing, you're a good writer, you're a native English speaker and writer, so it must be nice for you. And they're going to X out of this podcast because they're thinking, this is just hard for me. I'm not a good writer. I don't know how to do it. I don't speak English, as my first language. And so some people are in the misimpression, this misguided notion that it is some kind of magical gift. So and it may be for you. I mean, I don't know you that well, so maybe you were, as an infant, a very prolific writer. But could you kind of put us all into some kind of a framework of this is the kind of person who's talking to us now?
Yeah, definitely. I certainly would agree that I have privilege in learning English as a first language, and there are aspects of this process that are hard for some people in ways that it isn't for me. But I would definitely also say that I'm not a natural writer. As a child in school, my handwriting was bad. My penmanship was bad to the extent that my hand hurt regularly. And that was probably played a large role in me moving towards sciences. And the subjects I excelled in were those where I didn't need to write. And I hated history as a subject because I couldn't, I didn't want to put words on page. And I still don't enjoy writing sort of long bodies of text. So sort of writing does not come naturally to me. And writing within science even doesn't come particularly naturally. But some of the ways I've started to think about it have really helped. And so, yeah, the writing is it's huge. You know, writing papers, writing grants, you can't get far without being able to communicate your material well and increasingly efficiently as well.
So for someone like you, an admitted, self-confessed, not a natural writer, someone who did not like it, for whom it was physically painful for him, I love this. Now you're grounding us that, okay, now a lot of people are going, okay, good, this guy sounds like me. Tell people how you figured out some ways to hone this skill.
So one of the things that I found was writing is not universally hard for me. There are times when you get into a flow state and you're able to write. And what I ended up sort of deciding is that when I know what I want to write, writing is relatively easy. When it's difficult to know what to write, it is when it is difficult to write. And so even though I'm not a naturally structured person and always in school was highly resistant to any suggestion that I should plan my work ahead of doing it, because that felt like doing twice the work. I'm now a huge believer in sort of structuring the sections, sort of pre-agreeing with mentees what the different paragraphs of the introduction and the discussion will be, making sure that there is sort of a backbone of a narrative thread running through those sections. And what I've found is that I struggle to write when I don't know what to write.
I love this. And I underlined both of those words that I wrote down. When I know what I want to write is when it's easier for me. And then you talked about structuring the sections, even though you're not naturally, I guess for the Myers-Briggs, you're not on the J side. It sounds like you're on the P side, that you're not a big agenda, daily schedule, line by item, like to have a traveling itinerary. You're more a little spontaneous. So it's even more of a challenge for you to have a structure. So tell us more about this. It sounds like once you figured out a structure, that helps you figure out the what. And then it sounds like it's probably easier and then hence more enjoyable because you now have a structure or a plan. Am I on the right path here?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So for me, the things that I find easier to write within a paper, let's say, are the methods, because I know what I've done and I tend to think about the methods and the results as echoing each other. So if the methods say what I did, the results report what I found. And the parts of the paper that I find challenging are the introduction and the discussion, which are a little less prescriptive, little more open-ended. Yeah. And so the advice I've given to trainees most recently is to think of the introduction in a paper as being 4 paragraphs, let's say. And before writing it, what we do is we isolate those 4 bullet points. And so we get a bullet point for each paragraph, which expresses the central theme of that paragraph. And when we read those 4 bullet points together, they should show a narrative trajectory that makes sense leading through the paragraph. And then once we get to writing the paragraphs, one of the things that you find when writing, and especially when editing other people's writing, is the point at which things start to lose their way a little bit is when something gets in the wrong place. So you have a sentence which is a good sentence and something that needs saying, but it doesn't need to say it during this paragraph. And so we sort of get used to judging each sentence in terms of how well does it serve the purpose of the paragraph, and judging each word and phrase within a sentence as to how well does it serve the sentence. And so having that sort of structure lets us much more clearly identify where we went wrong. So often you have a paragraph which is sort of like, well, it's kind of good and it's kind of, but it's not quite hitting home and you can't quite see. And over again, what I notice is this happens when the theme is drifting during the paragraph, or there's a little bit of material that isn't in quite the right box.
Now, that is so important. And I'm thinking of a recent paper, drift, because this is another word I just underlined, drift. I am prone to drift because my brain is prone to drift. I feel like my brain is always like little things firing off here, here, and here, and here. And so I feel like I have to get I have to feel like I have to run around and touch all of those little sparks that are going off. And then inevitably I go down, like I call it, the YouTube hole, because I think of it almost like YouTube. Well, if I'm going to talk, so let me big picture this for you. So if I have data on late career faculty members in academia, and then we're talking about late career faculty members, maybe male, female differences, underrepresented in medicine differences, basic scientists versus clinician scientists. It's like 4 elements. It's kind of like 4 layers of depth. And before you know it, I feel like, well, if we're starting with late career faculty members, we got to talk about faculty members in general, then talk about where they are in the career trajectory, then start talking about gender differences. So I feel like we got to go down the thing of all the women and men. Then we go to UIM, underrepresented medicine. And now I got to talk about all that. And I just feel like every paragraph, or as you saying, a bullet point, I used to feel compelled to run down that hole of everything since, Socrates that's been known about each one of those things, and hence the drift, and always have to kind of go smack myself again, Kimberly, whoa, slow down. What's the main point? Instead of being, tugged by all those interesting little sparks.
Yeah, I definitely have the same thing. And what I find is by committing ahead of time to that structure, I can then use it as sort of a stick to beat myself with, and to try and force myself back into line. One area I really notice drift is between results and discussion, because the results is quite dry. It's, how many apples were there? There were 5 apples. It's not that interesting. What is interesting is the implications of that, comparing it to prior results. It's the discussion that's the meat of it. The results is just like, what did you find? And over again, there's the temptation to editorialize in the results section. And what I've found is that there's no point stopping myself from doing it. But what I do now is I write the results, and then when I find myself editorializing and discussing the implications of the results, I just immediately notice it. I copy and paste that and shove it down at the bottom for when the discussion starts coming. And so this thing of sort of dumping like all those little sort of holes that you go down, just push it out of the paragraph you're on because it doesn't belong there. Put it down at the bottom and come back and integrate it later. Or maybe it's not in this paper and it's something for a future paper. There's always a limit in what you can put in any paper, and there is a huge benefit in not trying to overextend yourself, both because it makes this paper easier to write and easier to read, and also, frankly, it saves material for the next paper because we're always looking for that as well.
Yeah, and you're so right, because I'm thinking when you said editorializing, I tend to do the same thing because I'm like you, and I think like most of us, the introduction, I'll want to give people the history of the world. And then in the discussion, I will find myself saying or hypothesizing or similarly kind of going down a trail like, well, you can't say that. What do you think? The results, the methods said you're going to do this. You found that. How in the world are you coming up with this supposition or this recommendation? You didn't even do that. But my brain's like, well, it kind of makes sense, right? And I got to say, no, dial it back, keep it simple. Don't open up a new can of worms that the reader, the editors are going to say, what are you talking about? You can't state that. You looked at late career faculty members. What are you now talking about early? You can't, that's a hypothesis that's been untested. You can't make the same assumption about that. So in the discussion, I also tend to want to let my mind spin. So you're reminding us to hone down, keep a structure, make everything reflect back is a good, I think, a good gauge.
Yes, definitely. And one of the things that I enjoy about the structure in that way is that it really keeps you moving forward. If you have a structure for your introduction, which is 4 paragraphs long, and you have a draft of those 4 paragraphs, you're done. You can read them on another day and maybe improve them. But for the most part, once you get to that stage, you're only going to make limited improvements. And actually what you need is someone else's input at that stage. And so it helps to sort of put an end to the process of improving things. And I think the temptation at an early stage in your career is to want to impress your seniors, which is a valid thing to want. But it can lead to inefficiencies in how you write, because you start to want to get your manuscript to 95% perfect before you'll show it to anyone. And particularly when there are structural deficiencies in how it's put together, there's no point at all in getting it to that 95% point. And so with my trainees, I want them to put in time and effort on making the manuscript good. It's not enjoyable for anyone to go through something that hasn't had effort put into it, but that isn't the problem that the majority of people have. And overwhelmingly, when we're looking at manuscripts, there is so much that changes in that first edit that the difference between whether it came to me at 85% done or 95% done is basically just dead time, because it's being changed so substantially anyway. And so that editing process is something I really wanted to get to talking about, because that for me has been one of the big sort of realizations over the last few years, is that as far as possible, when we do editing of manuscripts in my group, we try to co-edit the manuscripts. Now, before COVID, that was sitting next to each other at one computer in a room. Now, more often, it's over a Zoom with a shared screen. But I really believe quite passionately in the value of sort of co-editing manuscripts, synchronous editing of manuscript. Normally we're all used to this idea of the trainee works on a piece of work and they write it up and they bring a draft, and you send an email a draft to your advisor, and then you send another email reminding them about it. And eventually they get time to look at it. They look through your manuscript. It comes back with all those red lines. And so the thing moves forward. And this is a valid process. Your manuscript got better. You were told, sort of directed where to change it and whatever else, and you have a sense as to how to move forward. But I think that there is a much better process than that, and that is to actually sort of sit down and talk through the process together, to see not just what changes in the manuscript, but why those changes are being made. And the reason why I think this is so valuable is that for trainees, it's important to publish papers. So moving from N papers to N+1 papers is important. But the thing that will really serve you in your career for the future is not just writing that one paper. It's the lessons you learn about how to write papers are the really valuable thing. And so for most postdocs coming into my group, they've written 2 papers, 5 papers, maybe as many as 10 papers, but it's still a very small N. And the number of lessons they've been able to learn from each one is, you learn maybe 1 or 2 lessons for each iteration. And so no matter how impressive a CV people have coming in, they've all had limited opportunity to see scientific writing in practice. And I think that this process of learning how to write is increasingly, I think, is maybe the most important lesson that people are learning during their training. I've focused in beginning stages of my career much more on technical and, how on earth do I explain these quite technical ideas in our work to trainees? And that is sort of itself a valuable question. But as time's gone on, I've learned the value of having a diversity of expertise and a diversity of backgrounds in our group. Not everyone is doing those most technical pieces of work, but everyone is writing, and everyone needs to learn how to write. And so yeah, this idea of co-editing is just, it's really changed the way I think about the process. And I think I first came on it sort of from a cowardice of knowing that I am a very proactive editor of things. I tend to make a lot of changes. And maybe from my sort of past trauma, my first paper that I wrote, I slaved over this manuscript for, weeks and weeks and weeks. Sent it to my PhD advisor, who I sort of, have endless respect for, and I'm utterly terrified of his opinion in all things. And I didn't hear anything back, and then I sort of followed up. Okay, can you take a look at? Can you take a look at it? Eventually, sort of a few weeks more, I followed up, and he said, "Oh yes, well, I think maybe I'd better write the first draft on this one," which was basically to say that, what you've done is great, it's nice work, but it's so sort of structurally not where it needs to be that we're just going to start from a clean slate and start again. And that was a really valuable lesson for me. Maybe part of the valuable lesson for me is I try not to do that to my trainees. I think that, this wasn't done with malice, and we have an excellent relationship, and I took it in exactly the way that it was meant. But I'm scared of editing manuscripts and every word coming back red. Yeah. And I'm scared that the lesson when you do that in a vacuum is the thing that you sent me wasn't good. That's should never be the lesson. The lesson is I want that thing to be better, and I'm putting in my time and effort to make it better. And the extent of the red is not a judgment on what started, it's a judgment of the investment that has been put into it. And I think that one of the reasons I started co-editing was so I could communicate that to people as it was going. And over time, I found sort of so many advantages of this way of working, being able to explain the why, the value of trainees seeing me struggle, put a certain idea into words, not just to be able to say, okay, well, this sentence got crossed out and it became this sentence, but to really go backwards and forwards and say, well, what did you mean when you said this sentence? And this is one thing I learned from a non-scientist friend. He says when he reads things, often what he'll say to his people is, well, what did you mean by that? And they all know what they mean by it. And almost without exception, if you say to somebody, what did you mean by that? The answer is a better expression of the idea than the thing that's on the paper. Because we tend to write in one register and talk in another. And there's a place for different registers of language, but normally your spoken explanation is just more fluent than the written thing. So we say, what did you mean by that? And then you say, okay, well, let's say that. And so you get people to critique their own stuff. You guide attention. So it certainly isn't the same as them sitting in a room and making it better themselves. But there's real benefit in that idea of looking at it together, talking through the why, and seeing the process happen, not just the outcome presented as a track changes Word document.
So you are genius, and I love this on so many levels. So what we're talking about here is co-editing. And Richard Edden, I love that you are so empathetic and that your rich life experiences of the horror and the all-encompassing desire to please your mentor and impress your mentor, and we've all been there, of trying to demonstrate our value and show that we're smart, we are worthy. And there's nothing more demoralizing than someone you respect who, and this happened to me, I'm telling you, Richard, within the past, I'll say 5 or 6 years, a very, very respected genius, highly visible leader here at Hopkins, when I gave him a draft of a manuscript, basically said to me, and again, in all kindness and respect, you need help writing. And the thing that kind of like knocked me over and I threw up in my mouth a little bit was I had already had like 50 publications, but this manuscript was a completely different line of thought and science. And it really wasn't science. It was my publishing or trying to publish. I did ultimately that WAG work I mentioned, the writing accountability groups, because I wasn't testing a hypothesis. I wasn't doing science as I had always done. Rather, I was describing a tool or a process. And I really just struggled and didn't know what I was saying. And so I ended up just saying lots and lots of words, like I tend to think, and hope that if I put a lot of words out there, something will ultimately make sense. But when he said that to me, you really, in an email, he's like, you really need some help with writing. My instinct was like, yes, but I am good. I am worthy. I mean, I felt so embarrassed and I felt like I had kind of disappointed him. I really never really knew him. And then I was worried about my reputation and he's going to think I don't write, but I actually do read some of my other stuff. And what I love and somebody loves about you and your just way of being and your affect is that you so honestly and authentically drew on that experience and then discovered this process and recognized the value of this co-editing. And I'm just going to say one more thing and then I'm going to shut up again. And you were reminding me again, within the past 2 years, my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Jennifer Haythornthwaite, offered to review my promotion professor letter. And I had rewritten it 3 or 4 times. And she said, well, let's sit down together at my house. And I literally did the big eye roll, like, I don't need to sit down at your office with you and you read this. This sounds painful to me. I was never a good group person because all the chatter and the noise and too many people talking. I don't know how they do that in the movies. I'd be like, let's write a script together. And, 5 people start yammering. It always kind of freaked me out. But Richard Edden, what you are saying is exactly what hit me like a sledgehammer. When I sat next to her at the computer and she was reading, she said just that, what do you mean by this? Because when I'm reading this paragraph, what that makes me think is this. And isn't that? And what about the other? And then I started going to defense mode of, I say that later, but isn't it? And she's like, well, the mere fact that I'm asking you, Kim, I know you, Kim. You're not telling a good story there. So you're right. Had I gotten the revised, Jennifer saying, here, Kim, here's my revisions, take it for whatever you want, versus my hearing her saying, I don't know what you're talking about here. I thought you did thus and such. What do you mean by this? That did kind of make me go, well, isn't it obvious? No, it's not. And I'll be quiet there. Keep going.
Yeah, there's so many great ideas in what you've just talked about. The idea that you found you struggled as you moved from one kind of writing to another, and the idea that the form of different kinds of writing changes as the function of the writing changes. That as you think of postdocs progressing towards faculty, one of the big registers you need to learn is writing grants as opposed to writing paper manuscripts, and maybe a more future-orientated science writing compared to past-oriented, and the way of thinking about that has to be relearned. I think part of it, thinking about your experiences, I also do not receive criticism well. I even when I have a wonderful relationship with the person who is offering it, when I really believe that it is offered in good faith, when I know it is correct, particularly, it's difficult to handle. I do find that sort of negative feedback. I know that I need that, but my instinct is to fight it and to sort of justify and reject and sort of, especially when it hits home, is to be defensive in those ways. And so maybe some of coming towards this process is sort of just me sort of knowing how I feel on the other side of it. Another thing is I think it's playing to my strengths as a mentor. I don't really enjoy doing things on my own. I like to do things with other people. And that, for me, moving from being a postdoc to a faculty, that was one of the great promises, was that I would be able to work in a team, work with people. for me, the enjoyment of this co-editing is enormously larger than sort of editing on my own. I find it much easier to find time and the motivation to do it, because I feel like we're getting two things out of the process. We're not just moving the paper forward, which is important, but we're also sort of investing in the future and the future manuscripts. And so I enjoy it a great deal more also.
Could you, Richard, maybe describe briefly how to do this? So people are like, this sounds great. I kind of get the idea. You said that in the olden days, you'd sit next to each other and at a table, and now you're doing it virtually on Zoom. So can you just briefly take it from, say, a new trainee, and they've never done this co-editing with you, relative to someone who, like, say, Kim and Richard, we've done lots of papers together. How might that process look different, to give people who are listening to this an idea for literally how do you do it?
So if we sort of start with an introduction, which that's another funny story from our writing seminar with Dave Newsom, is he and I have diametrically opposed advice as to how to write. So it's important to recognize that some of what I say will be great for some people and terrible for other people. But if we say for now that we're starting at the introduction, first of all, I would have a backwards and forwards discussion about that structure. So I would advise people not to waste time on writing the introduction until we've agreed that framework of bullet points that tells the narrative thread of it, because there's no point writing 10 sentences on a theme that doesn't work. So this is all about efficiency of use of time. And when we have that narrative thread of bullet points, I say, okay, we'll expand each of these into a paragraph. And at the point where you've done that, we'll sit down and look at it together. And I do think this is instructive, especially at the beginning, not to do it by a whole manuscript, but just one section at a time. Because to get to the meat of discussing a whole manuscript in a single session is not possible. We're talking about more than an hour of discussing sort of each section, I would say. And so then we say, okay, well, this is the paragraph you have. Often I will encourage people to have those bullet points still as sort of interstitial markers between the paragraphs. And we'll start reading it and we'll say, okay, well, this first sentence, how is that good? And then often I'll say, well, one of the things I particularly like doing at the beginning of a paragraph, particularly at the beginning of a paper, is to have some kind of strong declarative statement. And so we beef up that very first sentence. And then bit by bit, we go through sentence by sentence saying, how does that serve the purpose of the paragraph? And invariably what we find is the second or third sentence is much too long. And so then we think about, well, how can we break that sentence into two parts? Because, it got long because you wrote the sentence and then realized you needed some sort of additional clause to explain a thing that hadn't been explained yet. Don't explain it in the additional clause, just add in a sentence preceding it to add that information. And so we just go through sentence by sentence, and overriding it is that question. It is how effective is this sentence in serving the purpose of the paragraph? When I read that sentence, does it clearly communicate meaning to me? Do I understand where you're getting at? And often when we have problems about individual sentences, it's just a matter of thinking, okay, well, what did you mean by that? And the answer is the answer. And when it's not just an individual sentence, but the paragraph sort of slightly losing its way, by asking that question, does this sentence serve the paragraph, you can start to figure out where it lost its direction. Mm-hmm. And then as you get towards the end of the paragraph, you don't want to sort of gate crash the next session, and you really want to maintain sort of a segregation of purpose between the paragraphs. But you do want to sort of walk up to the brink. And so the closing of the first paragraph will sort of make the beginning of the next one make sense. And so we sort of walk through it step by step with that kind of a process.
Now, this is so helpful. I'm thinking about the length of the duration of a session that where you are co-editing a manuscript? Because some of this to me sounds so tedious and so exhausting. And I'm imagining if I am like so impressed with Richard Edden, I am like horrified and terrified. And it's almost the mental, like the weight of doing this and feeling like I'm making poor Dr. Edden work so hard on my paragraph. Do you go at this? Is this like a high intensity interval training class where you're doing 15 minutes of a session, or are you hammering away for an hour on a paragraph?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that we are going, so I believe in chunking stuff. So really, my preference is to do this for as long as possible, and the limit is normally my stamina of, I can feel that fog coming in my brain, and the mental tiredness just sets in, and I know, okay, I would love to carry on with this, but frankly, it's 2:30 in the afternoon. You're not getting the best of me anymore, and we need to just put a lid on it for today. Not everything that we've addressed is sort of closed, particularly where you sort of offer feedback on figures or whatever, you don't actually do it live. So there's often things that can be done on the trainee side, this is something I know about myself. I can write well at certain periods of the day. I can think well at certain periods of the day. When I get to the end of that, it's not all the work I can do in a day. There's a lot of really boring, non-strenuous activities in my job as well that I can carry on and doing. But I need to know myself and know when I can and can't write effectively. For me, it's sort of a morning thing because that's where my brain works better. For other people, it's like the middle of the night. It's just finding your place.
And what you said earlier, this is so important that this shows good mentorship, because especially when you are co-editing, the trainee or your colleague can see all this live. And again, I love your honesty and your transparency that it really opens up more just a feeling of security and safety of you just saying, listen, I'm getting tired here. I'm starting to get the fog's rolling in. It's time for either a coffee or a nap or a walk. And I think we're done here. That just saying that is another lesson that our trainees are learning, that not only are you honest, that you're not some superhero god, that they will never be like you. And they, why bother? It's just, this guy is amazing. And I'm just no good. And it also teaches us to, as a faculty person, to go, okay, he's tired. It gives me permission to be tired, to be brain fog. He has brain fog. Oh my gosh, who knew? It's like the anti-CV, the idea of people who have, we judge our insides by other people's outsides and then determine that we are inferior, not realizing that Dr. Edden has lots of rejected grants and lots of rejected papers. So I love the process that to me feels, not only is it so informative because I'm learning how you, my mentor, thinks, and not that it's all perfect, but this kind of this going back and forth. I'm kind of envisioning almost like watching an NIH study section. It's one thing to write a grant application. It's another thing, if you could be a fly on the wall, to be, a little watching and hearing the way the discussions happen. And then that helps you understand, oh, they're asking about that. That teaches, even if it's not about your grant, it teaches you how the language is understood and how people think. So much about what you do.
Yes,
I love.
Seeing the process happen is a huge part of it. But particularly I enjoy. So last week I was editing a manuscript with somebody, and I don't get the message right the whole time. At some point they said, oh, I see that I should have done a better job of this before I sent it to you. And I was like, no, that's not the message here. The message is, this is what we're doing. You did a great job. The fact that we've changed all of this isn't about the job that was done. But what we need to do is we need to sort of start to learn how to think about the writing and how to think about putting it together. And one of the great things that happened, in this same paragraph, it wasn't working. There was some things where you're sort of like, okay, well, I'm not really sure what that is. And so I basically sort of hit a few carriage returns in and said, okay, well, up until this point, we're doing great. And then we sort of lose our way. So let's just shove it down here and have another think. And I had a think, and I had a little bit more of a think. And I was stuck. So I could identify that this thing wasn't really working, but I myself couldn't really identify what, therefore, where do we need to go instead? And so I consulted with the heading of that paragraph, and that was sort of helpful. But what we found out was that heading wasn't proscriptive enough to be guiding. And so then we can either think about, okay, well, do we just let the paragraph guide itself and amend that description? Or maybe do we sort of think about what is this bit doing within the whole? So you can actually sort of edit those paragraph summaries when you find that they aren't giving you the guidance that you require. And then we go back down. And I really felt that the process of the trainees seeing me struggle to do this, having written, a lot of manuscripts, order of magnitude more than they have, that's really, really valuable, and something that is lost when you just get the finished process. Because, we got somewhere pretty good. It was a paragraph that worked well and that hung together, did a good job. But then being able to say, okay, well, I write this and I get stuck halfway through the sentence and I rub it out, I start again. And like that process, I think, can be enormously valuable for trainees, because you read manuscripts in the literature and they're all good. And some of them are better written than others, but they're all good because they've all been read by 5 authors and 3 reviewers and 1 sub-editor, and they've all been through the mill to such a degree that sort of sets the bar very, very high in a way that can be intimidating or discouraging. And so to see the process live of, we're not trying to get to the end today. We're just trying to move this thing forward and have a manuscript that is better when we leave it than when we found it.
This is just so great, Richard. And I'm just thinking about how they make the sausage. And what popped in my head was, imagine if those of you who have children, just showed the child a picture of a tied shoe. You want to learn how to tie your shoe? Well, here, I'll show you 15 different pictures of tied shoelaces. Look at my shoe. See, it's tied. Do that. There's so much value, and we could all think of a million examples of watching an expert diagnostician come up with a disease and recognizing a pattern of symptoms that points to some certain disease, or a surgeon, having trouble finding all the cancer or all the whatever. Mechanic diagnosing a problem. They're building a house. It's so incredibly valuable to watch the master do the thing and learn from her or his, technique and mistakes. And yet in writing, like you said, Richard, so perfectly, we compare, we don't see how the sausage is made. No one lets us in the kitchen. We look at the journal article and go, oh man, I could never write that. Yeah, you can. It's a skill. It's learned like anything else. And your process of co-editing, I think, is such a great example on so many levels of not, again, only mentoring and obviously the skill of writing, but just confidence and life skills, and all that can be translated down to subsequent generations of just talking it out and taking the time. You're going to do it yourself. Why not have the person there? Because I imagine the learning is a lot quicker. The uptake from the mentees, the trainee side, is faster because you start to hear Richard's voice in your head. When you start putting those 4 bullet points together for my 4 pair, I would start to hear your voice, I imagine. So I imagine that investment of time with someone sitting next to you serves so many purposes, and especially if you like people, like a lot of us do, like being around people. It's a win. It's a win all around, right?
Yeah, definitely. That hearing the mentor's voice in the back of your head, I think that's, you'll hear that voice, whether it's a curse or a blessing, sort of depends on what your mentor is saying. There's one classic quote from my PhD mentor. he was sort of, I'm not sure that's the introduction I would have written. And he had this very dry way of presenting things. And I think that, I hear this in my head. You hear that advice, and, to have sort of, like you say, seen the sausage being made is really good. And as you mentioned, I see some of my mentees now have sort of moved to faculty, and I see them acting out this process with their mentees as well. And that's really encouraging. It also rather underlines the sort of seriousness of it. There are some of the things that I teach people that are really important, and some of them that are just my little things that don't matter. And so I do sort of, start to feel the responsibility of, we've got to figure out which of these things are important and which of them are just, the way I like to do things. Like, does that line really have to be 0.75 points wide, or could it be just fine at 1.5? Or, it's sort of getting down to what matters. I think is sort of a new challenge. As you refine this process.
Dr. Richard Edden, you are a joy. You are a gift to all your trainees, to Hopkins. Friends, I hope you have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have, and I hope you've learned some stuff. And if you'd like to have a personal think with Dr. Richard Edden, you could probably shoot him an email at Edden, EDDEN, @jhu.edu. Very easy, EDDEN @jhu.edu. So wonderful. Great. I love this concept of co-editing. I'm going to leave the final thought to you, Richard.
Well, I just want to say thank you. I love these podcasts that you put together. I'm so grateful to you for the encouragement. And I have enjoyed discussing this. Absolutely. If anyone wants to talk to me about co-editing and some of these ideas, I'd be happy to have an email conversation about it, or maybe even more a 3:00 in the afternoon call when I'm too tired to think about writing. I hope that this has been helpful, and that you're able to analyze the writing process, learn more from thinking about it, and to help develop your trainees through it.
Perfect. See you all next time on the Faculty Factory podcast. Tell all your friends. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Faculty Factory Podcast. The mission of the Faculty Factory is to build and support a community of leaders in faculty development who share tools, resources, wisdom, and encouragement in service to our faculty members, schools, and institutions. We encourage you to go to facultyfactory.org to find out more. Get in touch with me, ask me any questions. Maybe you want to be interviewed on the podcast. Thanks for tuning in to Faculty Factory Podcast. We'll see you next time. The Faculty Factory podcast and website is sponsored by the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine Office of Faculty. For more information, visit facultyfactory.org.